the next paper, moving backwards in the Demosthenes corpus, we're moving from Demosthenes 23 to Demosthenes 22. I suppose that's the focus of Ifigeneia PhD. Ifigeneia Giannadaki, as you know her very well, and we're really privileged to have Ifigeneia here. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Ifigeneia. So thank you very much once again for the brilliant organization of the conference.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. Don't forget Professor Kara, who's sitting here.
I don't. So with your researchers cap on, please talk to us about different ways of misleading, I guess, the dikastai.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction. And since this conference is all about use and abuse of law, please let me briefly abuse a few seconds of my talk, my time, just to say a huge thank you to all of our distinguished speakers for the presentations, all the 3 days, even though it's early morning. A huge thanks to our generous sponsors, and of course, a huge thanks to Professor Kari. Athenian law had no formal legal theory, no unified law code, written verdicts, or system of precedent, as we find it in modern legal systems. For us, Athenian law is untidy, and it was never fully systematized, despite repeated attempts to tidy up the legislative process. Unlike modern law systems, where there is a unified law code and formalized jurisprudence, in Attic law courts, citation and interpretation of the laws come from the litigants themselves and are inevitably partisan. They manipulate and sometimes distort the law in the interest of persuasively presenting their case. In the orators, law is part of the rhetoric of the speech, and it acquires its own narrative, analogous to the narrative of the facts. This includes competing and complementing rationalizations of the legal system designed to advance the specific legal arguments. This strategy amounts to the creation of a story of law. Law acquires its own narrative and becomes an effective tool of persuasion. This subject has been recently touched upon by Victoria Woolf, who sets the essential frame in her elegant and articulate reading of forensic legal narratives. This paper attempts to build on and extend Victoria's discussion, especially with reference to the speech against Androtion, where the rhetoric of law is manifestly exploited and offers a good opportunity to see the narrative of law in this case, which is not discussed in that study, in contrast with other competing and complementing narratives. The speech is written for the authors in prosecuting Androtion through a graphi paranomon, a public action for introducing an illegal decree which proposed grant of honors to the outgoing bully of 356. Although such cases involve technicalities of law and one would normally expect citation and collation of old and new legislation to prove the infringement, there is no such treatment of the law in this speech. The clerk never reads any of the laws allegedly broken by Androtion's decree. Instead, the 4 legal objections raised by the authors are incorporated in the narrative. Among the authors' most skillfully presented arguments in terms of juridical discourse is the allegation of Androtion's prostitution. We are given very briefly the clause from the law regulating sexual conduct of citizens, according to which, if a man prostituted himself, he was banned from public speaking. That's passage 1. However, Androtion is expected to claim that if the authors had evidence to charge him for prostitution, he should have chosen the most appropriate procedure, the graphi heteroiseos, not the graphi paranomon. The authors presents an elegant and seductive depiction of the legal system, which is flexible enough to allow various types of actions for a single offense. This is text 2. The flexibility according to this model consists in choosing a legal action on the basis of the calculation of the risk, the prospects of success, and the nature of punishment. Text 3. This system is not, however, the Athenian system, but a selective distillation. Demosthenes has no desire to present an accurate account of the system, but he blurs and obscures the circumstances of detection, the identity of the prosecutor, by suppressing the substantive distinctions between the various offenses he mentions to achieve persuasion. He presents the range of procedures available in cases of theft and impiety, and the narrative follows a hierarchical arrangement of actions on the basis of the skill and confidence of the victim. Thus, Demosthenes evades the need for an argument relying purely in the substance of law, creating instead a coherent narrative of the legal system, which well serves his rhetorical purposes. Although his starting point is theft and impiety, he expands the application of his model to almost every delict. This systematization, especially the tight hierarchy, adds considerable plausibility to his argument. The effectiveness and plausibility of this model is underpinned by arguments relying on the intent of the lawgiver, another strategy of manipulating legal narrative, as it will be shown in a minute. Diodorus's elegant model is in stark contrast with Hypereides' rationalization and representation of the system in his defense speech for Xenipos. This is text 4, where he challenges the employment of Ifigeneia against Xenipos on the grounds that the latter was not a rhetor against whom the procedure could be employed. Here, it is the nature of the offense, not the ability of the prosecutor, that determines the choice of the procedure. And for each delict, there is a specific law and the designated official to accept the case. Where Demosthenes maximizes the diversity of procedures, Hypereides eliminates the options available and provides a foreclosing model of the system. Having attributed this highly elaborate systematization of the legal system, he deductively proceeds to his challenge of the employment of Ifigeneia in Xenipos' case. He therefore implies that the prosecution has stretched the interpretation of the law of Ifigeneia and applied it to every citizen, not only the rhetors as the law allegedly implies. The existence of these competing rationalizations of the legal system does not necessarily invalidate the former or the latter, but it manifestly shows the function and dynamics of such juridical narratives which conceptualize the system according to the rhetorical purposes they serve. What the two competing models share is a persuasive but reductive representation of the untidy legal system as logically, coherently, and tightly structured in order to conceal the weaknesses of Diodorus's legal argument to challenge Androtheon's status in Demosthenes 22, and to challenge the interpretation of Ifigeneia law to include not only politicians, but also idiote in the speech for Xenipos. This practice is not confined to political and public actions. Demosthenes, in another speech against Conon, offers another sophisticated narrative, a story about the genealogy of law dealing with violence, text 5. More specifically, this is a case of battery brought against Conon, who allegedly beat and verbally abused Ariston. Ariston, in his attempt to effectively preempt Conon's defense, who is expected to laugh the whole matter off as a trivial private issue, offers a tight model of the system according to which every act of violence is punished through a specific procedure, and the law does not allow pleas on the ground of mitigating circumstances. More precisely, these laws regulating a range of procedures available against violent behavior are presented in hierarchical order, in inverted hierarchy compared to the story of Diodorus, ranging from the less serious offense, the verbal abuse, to the most serious, death. In Ariston's reconstruction of the genealogy of law, violence exists before and outside the law, which was created at a later stage to prevent the cycle of its escalation. Consequently, where against Androtion sees diversity as complete freedom, here diversity is seen as foreclosing options. Against Konon has more in common with Hypereides than the against Androtion. This juridical discourse, therefore, functions as a means of forestalling the line of Konon's argument, according to which a certain level of conflict is normal and innocuous, and his attempt to turn the whole issue to laughter. Lysias 1, the speech against Philetos for killing Eratosthenes, who was caught in the act of illicit sex with Philetos' wife, a much cited passage in the last 2 days, offers another example of a juridical narrative in contrast with Theodorus' model. Philetos claims that the killing of Eratosthenes was not his choice, but the sanction prescribed by the homicide law in cases of Mihoia. Philetos never cites the laws dealing with Mihia, but he rather relies on the clause of the homicide law, authorizing killing in such cases. He cunningly conceals and suppresses the other legal procedures available, less extreme than killing, and his narrative presents the case from the outset as a prosecution not of himself for homicide, but of the debtor Eratosthenes for Mihoia. Killing was not his option, but it was the dictum of the law. He's just their agent. Killing is stressed as the only available procedure, but Philetos' restrictive model of the system tacitly suppressed the range of procedures available, as we learn from other sources. He was not obliged to kill, as Philetos would have us to believe. This remarkably misleading and very brief legal narrative suppresses the procedural flexibility to prosecute the offense in question, and it effectively minimizes any chance to pursue Mihia but execution. Another fascinating narrative of law comes from Ifigeneia against Timarchos, where Timarchos is being charged for speaking before the assembly, although a former prostitute. Ifigeneia, in dealing with a very weak case in terms of its legal ground, he presents the wider legal frame of the case by offering an extended narrative regarding the rationale of the laws regulating sexual conduct, not only of the politicians, but the citizens throughout their lives. This is text 6, which is again much discussed during the conference so far. This narrative is arranged in chronological order, not only to give the impression of the existence of a well-defined law code, but also to show the continuous violation of all the laws by Timarchos. The law's biography is designed to illustrate Timarchos's. Ifigeneia argues that the lawgiver has established laws which regulate the decent behavior of a citizen from the date they start going to school, their conduct as adults, as officials and politicians. His evasive and misleading narrative conceptualized the lawgiver's aim to keep citizens away from improper, shameful, and illegal behavior at every stage of their lives by producing decent citizens, the opposite type of citizen compared to that which Timarchos exemplifies. Thus, this biography of law is employed largely to amplify the improper conduct of Timarchos. He has not just violated a single law, but he has continuously breached the laws by living a shameful life throughout. In fact, his narrative of law is well designed to conceal the lack of solid evidence to prove Timarchos' prostitution. However, the charge is never proved. Timarchos is manifestly convicted. Another distorted narrative of law is found in the speech of Hypereides against Athinogenes, again very popular over Aristophanes. The speaker, who is the prosecutor, has agreed to an open-ended contract, but when he discovers debts incurring from his purchase, he disputes the agreement. He then anticipates that Athinogenes will introduce the contract law and attempts again to preempt his defense. we are given in passing a clause of the law regulating contracts, which reads, all agreements made by one man with another are to be binding. More specifically, our speaker retorts that the law recognizes as binding only fair contracts, and he challenges the agreement on the basis of both the misstatements and the location it was made. In addition, he introduces a series of laws irrelevant to his case and argues by analogy and parallelism about the contract law, a point already made earlier. The laws, which authorize as binding only fair agreements and sales, honest betrothals, and wills which have not been influenced by constraining factors, to press the supposed trickery under which his contract was made. Therefore, by briskly mentioning a clause of the contract law, he distorts this law and restricts its application only in cases of just agreements. The distortion in this case almost reaches the limit of invention, but this legal narrative is cogent since the entire interpretation of the laws mentioned gives a sense of a consistent law code within which the contract law has its place. To come back to our main focus, the speech against Androtion, there is another feature of the manipulation of the legal system which becomes a constant diegetic element: the exploitation of the intent of the lawgiver. Although there was never any record of the debates which led to the creation of any given law, and therefore any such reconstruction based on the intent of the lawgiver is necessarily subjective and conjectural, litigants design elegant rationalization of the laws and the supposedly original rationale of the lawgiver to support their version of the legal system. The authors finds it useful to rationalize and interpret the lawgiver's inner thoughts in legislating by tracing the rationale behind specific legislation and ascribing it his subjective interpretation of the law to claim authority. His manipulative reconstruction of the system is attributed to Solon, and flexibility becomes a consciously sought element credited to the original democratic lawgiver. This is passage 2. Arguments based on the spirit of the law and the intention of the lawgiver are further exploited in the speech, not only to give credibility and authority to the interpretation of Theodorus's reading of the law, but also as a means of constructing ethos and portraying the involved parties in the case in political terms, through the antithesis democracy versus oligarchy. Androtion's alleged prostitution is described as a threat to the democratic constitution. This is text 7. And the dikastai are implicitly required to vote against him for a conviction would be in accord with the spirit and rationale behind Solon's law, and they will eventually sustain the stability of the democracy. This type of argument seems to be a consistent feature in this rationalization of the system already discussed. Ifigeneia's biography of law and the tight systematization of the system based on chronological order is emphatically attributed to Solon, Dracon, and other unnamed lawgivers. This is the underlined parts of text 6. In addition, the insight to the mind of the most famous lawgivers and the implied consistency in legislating process regulating the conduct of the citizens highlights the tight hierarchy and offers an illusion of the continuous efforts of the legislators to sustain a consistent law code. Similarly to Demosthenes 22, Ariston in Demosthenes 54 attributes his reconstruction of the genealogy of the law to the lawmaker, although his identity is more oblique. This is text 5. Again, the underlined parts. It is relevant it is revealed by the personification of the laws which think, foresee, and prevent the escalation of violence. Along the same lines, Hypereides argues against Athenogenes based on the artificial analogy of the laws regarding wills, betrothals, and sales by tracing an allegedly common feature, fairness. This is text 8 in these laws. This is how he eventually justifies his prosecution on the grounds that his agreement with Athenogenes was unfair. Now, if one turns to the rhetoricians, Aristotle and the author of the Rhetoric to Alexander, and compare their discussions of law as essentially anathema species and supplementary proof, respectively, which it either should be stressed by the orators if the law favored their case, or undermined if their legal grounds were weak. As modern scholarship has demonstrated, the rhetoricians do not recognize the potential of the employment of law besides its purely formulaic use to make a legal point. In the orators, however, law is part of the rhetoric of the speech and acquires its own narrative, analogous to the narrative of the facts in the speeches. As my presentation has shown, or I think it has shown, law and its rhetoric was elaborately used by the orators in a variety of flexible and seductive legal narratives, both by prosecutors, as in Demosthenes 22, Demosthenes 54, the Athenogenes speech, and Aeschines 1, and the defendants, as in the case of Lysias 1 and Xenippos. These narratives range from manipulation through partial citation of laws, for a topic that we heard a lot about yesterday by Professor Rubinstein, as in cases 22, again 54, and Lysias 1, to legal narratives irrelevant to the main issue and distortion of the laws, as is the case of the speech against Athenogenes, or citation of a wide legal frame of a case, and this is Aeschines 1. The prosecutors open up or restrict the employment of legal procedures. The defendants, similarly, suppress the flexibility of the system in the choice of the procedure, or challenge the employment of a given procedure by the opponent, relying on the literal interpretation of the law. The litigants were not formally constrained from citing partially or misinterpreting a law, but the citation of non-existent law was punished with death. However, the surviving speeches reveal a complex rhetorical use of laws whose presentation, arrangement, and space almost always has an element of artful use. This is not to say that the rhetoric surpassed law, but law becomes an element of the rhetoric, although a case was always introduced based on legal grounds. To sum up, the speech against Androtion shows the dynamics of the narrative of law, which is shaped through a variety of manipulative modes by which Demosthenes attempts a rationalization of the untidy and notoriously unsystematized Athenian system in order to achieve persuasion. The presentation of a coherent, vivid, and superficially cogent narrative of the legal frame within which the trial is taking place, by the careful strategy of simplifying and even distorting its complexities, becomes a very appealing mode of argumentation in his arsenal. A system in which there was no record of verdicts or binding precedent acquires its own concept of jurisprudence at the level of the rhetoric of law. More impressively, it acquires different coexisting models of conceptualization of the law. But as Professor Rubinstein famously remarked, these differentiated models may well reflect the flexibility on an ideological level, which allowed the exploitation of this type of legal reasoning, and in fact, competing rationalizations may not have been as contradictory as they may seem in a system which has never developed formal legal doctrines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ifigeneia, for an excellent paper. I'm sure there will be questions, and let me break with tradition and start with David Phillips.
Thank you very much for that. I want to ask you primarily about Demosthenes 54, which is your text 5. I think you're clearly right to argue that this is limitative from 17 to 19. But I think it's interesting to compare it with the very beginning of the speech, which is a great testament to flexibility, where Aristotle says, well, I consulted my family and friends. They said I could have brought a graphe hybreos, I could have brought an apagoge, but I'm too young to do that, so I decided to do the dikastai. What's interesting to me is that in this passage that you have here, where he has a sort of ladder of escalation, neither the graphe hybreos nor apagoge, which are his other two options according to him, are included, and especially the fact that hubris, you might expect hubris to be somewhere on here. So I wanted to see what your thoughts were about the difference, the pretty stark difference between the procedurally flexible notion at the beginning of the speech and the more limitative one here.
Yes, thank you very much for this point. I mean, I think it's a perfect example of this kind of flexibility, even in the same speech. So you have this kind of play at the beginning. So my friends were advising me to bring the X or a more severe procedure, but I went for the less severe and risky. I think this is partly part of his part of the strategy of the ethos. So you have presumably an unexperienced speaker, and he wants to present himself not as a well-learned man who was studying the laws, and he wanted to bring this severe procedure. Although we know that his argumentation or his rhetoric, if I'm allowed the expression, he manipulates or he exploits the rhetoric of hubris throughout the speech. So you have this kind of flexible opening, but then when it comes to this point, somehow he goes the other way around, so he restricts the model. I think this is just a perfect illustration that you can't have this kind of manipulative narratives, according to my terminology, but so even in the same speech. Thank you so much for this point.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to like in this paper, and I must say there are quite a few things to like. I just want to add one piece of evidence which is actually going to take your point further, and I think would actually support your basic point. I think a very important methodological point, which I fully agree with, is these general statements about how the Athenian legal system works cannot be divorced from the rhetorical context. I know Lena has already made this point, and I think it is very, very well taken. I think you did an excellent job actually of placing these in their rhetorical context. You just didn't take them out and say, we can take this as a, as a statement. There's one more actually you could even add to this that I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's in Isocrates and on the antithesis, and he actually talks about the procedures for sycophancy. And he has this implicit idea that the more serious the offense, the more numerous the procedures. Now, this fits in with the general pattern because he has a rhetorical reason for saying this. Because because what he wants to do is he wants to say sycophancy is a really awful crime. And therefore, he is taking a view of the legal system which supports his rhetorical point. That I think will support you. There's another general question. This question, you're absolutely right about the intent of the lawgiver. And if I could just tell a brief anecdote. The problem is who is this lawgiver and how do we find out what his intent was? Just a small anecdote. There was a very famous strike at the Pullman strike in 1894, and the federal government, the Attorney General only, used the federal injunction in a very unusual way. What he did is he invoked the Sherman Antitrust Act, and he used that. He said the strike was a restraint of trade, and therefore the federal government had a reason to actually bring an indictment. If they didn't stop didn't stop this, actually what they would do is they send in federal troops. The strike didn't stop. They sent in federal troops. This sent back. This sent back the development unions in the United States for about 4 years. But during this, it was very interesting because Sherman was actually in the Senate at the time, and there was discussion of Olney's use of this. And Sherman actually stood up and said, "I'm the author of this act. That was not my intent at all." And the curious thing is that even though he was there in the Senate and said this was not the intent of my legislation, it didn't stop Olney. They still used it in the same way. It didn't make any difference. At any rate, the one question is are these discussions, this talk about the legislator, is this always, you think, an ad hoc invention? Or is there some consistency from one speech to another about what they say about, the intent, the lawgiver intends this, the lawgiver intends this? That's what I'm just wondering if there is there possibly a common view about what the intent is, or is this always just a rhetorical construct?
Thank you very much for both your points and for the ambiguous speech. I will definitely include that. Going back to your second point, I think with the litigants tend to cite Solon mainly, and the famous lawgivers, so we see quite frequently the figure of Solon. But we have Dragon in this passage and side, and then the unnamed lawgiver. I think Solon is the best if you need to argue about something, about the legal point. I think Solon is your obvious would be your obvious choice. So I think Solon is somehow the use of the appeal to the authority of Solon is somehow consistent. But you have, and again, unnamed lawgivers, or a tendency to see even the judges the same themselves as the lawgivers in certain cases. So I think, on the one hand, we have this frequent citation of Solon or Draco or famous lawgivers to give authority to their arguments, and the rhetoric of the manipulated or the rhetoric they use. But on the other hand, we have more generic remarks like the lawgiver or you themselves when you pass this with the X law or the X degree. But it's a very interesting one, and I'll definitely look at it more closely.
We have.
No, don't worry about me.
1 minute. Stephen.
Yes. Follow up to your answer to David Phillips' question.
Yeah.
I have been struck as you gave your paper with your passage 5, the Demosthenes 54 passage,
Yes.
that there was so much indirect speech, that the explanations are phrased "fasi," "akuo," "they tell me," "I hear."
Yeah.
I think what your answer is going to be is this is because he's a private citizen, relatively young, and if he went round pontificating about the intentions of Solon, it would sound absurd.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. This is another point that we should take into account. Yeah. That's why I tried to show that we have this kind of narratives, not specifically in private or specifically in public cases, but yeah, I mean, I take your point, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much for this. And he's young as well, so yeah, we certainly need to take into account various parameters. Thank you.
You were going to make this point anyway, so the point was yours. And on this
but I didn't.
So on this note, let's thank Ifigeneia.
Thank you very much.